Drug-Haunted Violin Virtuoso Dies at 60 by John W. Toohey. The rain soaked him to the bone, and the gloom overcast drained all of the humor from him. How many days had it rained? 3? No, 4. And the cold, that raw winter cold. He had not expected to see them at the burial, especially not on such a miserable day like this. He had to stand with them at the burial, since standing apart from them would have seemed confrontational. So he stood with them. In that frame of things, it surprised him when Wolfe leaned in front of Schuyler and whispered, "Mary, join us for drinks afterwards. We'll lift a pint to our friend's passing." He mentioned a place, the Harp, or something else. He said yes, but he resented it. He felt that he should have said no. Pint, indeed, he mused. Where does he think he is? England? We don't lift pints in America. We drink a beer, and beer is cold, and it's not the right weather for drinking beer or anything else. He left well before they did, and decided to take the coward's way out and go home. He would never see them again anyway. Pint, indeed. On the solitary and silent drive back to Georgetown, the roads were covered in a thick gray fog that seemed to take a life of its own as it floated from the Potomac and melted across the roadway. He parked on 35th Street, bounded down the sidewalk, shielding his head from the rain, when he spotted the warm, soft glow of coffee shops' lights on O Street, beckoning his weary bones. Coffee. Warmth. He'd take it. His bony fingers are cold and white. The thick smell of freshly brewed beans relaxing him. Removing his wet raincoat, his tweed country walking hat, he ordered a cup from the tall and lean young man behind the counter. Black, no sugar. He took a seat at the small round wooden table that looked out into the cold and dreary Georgetown streets, and folded his cold hands around the cup, and relaxed to the rhythmic sound of the rain falling on the tin roof above him. The bright lights gave the cafe a sense of protective coziness, and that was what he needed at the moment. Guilt got the best of him. It always did. He called Wolfe, and he said, "Ernest here. Look, I'm in Georgetown at a coffee place on 35th and O. There's plenty of parking. It's far too early for drinks. Come by here, and I'll flip for coffee." Wolfe agreed, reluctantly and grumbling, but he agreed. Mary would come with him, of course, because Mary had absolutely no backbone around Wolfe. It was why they made such a successful partnership later on. He put down the phone and returned to the events of the day. So he was dead. And he was so young, only 60. And then, looking around the cafe filled with the fresh young faces of Georgetown students, he thought, my God, 60, and am I really so old that I hail 6 decades as young? All right, so maybe he wasn't young. It was more that he always seemed young, because he was so vibrant, even at the end, when cirrhosis killed him. He took a deep breath and sighed louder than he intended, causing one of the students at a table full of students to turn and give him a scornful look. He sneered back at him, and the boy looked away. Scorn, he thought. It's what youth does best. Well, that and travel in packs. He was a solitary man, and always had been. Returning to his gaze out the window, he watched them park at the far end of the street and start to jog towards the cafe, covering their heads from the raindrops above. He turned and ordered 2 teas, Earl Grey, and a coffee for Wolfe, and returned to the view on the street. He studied them carefully. Glee, also known as Susan, the departed soul's wife, although lovely, tall and graceful as ever, looked old and tired. The lines in her stately face were deep and shouted out her weariness. Mary, once the protégée of the departed, walked slightly behind her, of course, beautiful but timid, younger than all of them. She had been their secretary of sorts, and now she was just another friend who remembered things past. And then there was Wolf. God help us all. Look at how large he's gotten. By the time they were close to the door, the teas and coffee were ready. He collected them, placed them at the table just as they entered. He stood, greeted them all, embracing Susan, kissing Mary's hand and offering a curt nod to Wolf, and then remained standing in the traditional shuffling of positions, and then he sat. Mary unbuttoned her heavy coat to reveal her slim and curvaceous figure, and turned to him and said, "It's all like a bad dream, isn't it?" "Let's not discuss it," Susan said as she removed her coat and hat, and then pulled him closer and gently kissed him on the forehead, and said, "Let's just talk about the old times, shall we? The good times." "I don't like this chair," Wolf said. "Terrible view." "Would you like mine?" Mary asked with a smile. Wolf looked over the offering and said, "No, that only seems worse. I'll take yours, Ernest." "Screw you," he replied. It was the only way to handle Wolf. Wolf looked around the shop with disdain. He did disdain very well. His eyes looked over the faded black and white tiles on the walls and ceiling and asked, "What is this place? Has the feel of a morgue." "It's a coffee shop," Ernest answered. "It's a place where nice people go to drink coffee. I bought you one." He pointed to the cup in front of him. Wolf took the cup, placed it close to his nose, and smelled the coffee. A flask then appeared from his raincoat, and he poured a bit into the cup. The young man behind the counter pointed an accusing finger at Wolf and said, "There's no liquor here, sir." "I know, dear boy," he answered, pouring a pinch more. "That's why I brought my own." Susan sat to my left and clasped my hands in hers. "How are you, Ernest?" Mary leaned forward in her chair to hear his answer. He felt nervous and played with the rim of his coffee cup. "I've been better," he answered as he inspected the cup. "You're depressed over what happened recently," Susan said. "Why?" Wolf asked. "What happened recently?" "She means," Mary answered, "his death. Depressed over the death." "I'm not depressed over his death," he said, and added as an afterthought, "All right, maybe a little depressed." He paused again and said, "I'm very depressed over it." "People die," Mary said as she aimlessly stirred her coffee. "If only I had—" Silence fell over them. "If only you had what?" Wolf asked. She shrugged. "I don't know." "I gave up on him," Ernest answered sadly. "We all did," Mary replied with a tilt to her head. "Well, I certainly didn't," said Susan, and she was right in that. She had stayed with him through it all, even after he divorced her. She was there for him. "I feel numb," she said to no one in particular. "It all seems so meaningless. It took me 5 hours to get ready this morning, and I can't recall a single moment." "Have you asked yourself the question?" Wolf said. "Is this something worth being depressed about?" He leaned forward when he spoke. He always did that. Leaned forward into a person's space, and I hated it when he did it, and I was thankful for the table between them. "What sort of asinine proposition is that?" Ernest asked. "You want me to be happy about this?" "I want you to see it for what it is," he answered with a shrug. "And what it is, and what it's all about, is that it's about time. It's about time he died." "Oh, that's lovely," Ernest said. "I'm so glad you came along to the funeral. You're a delight, really." "Oh, Wolf," Susan cried, "what in heaven's name is wrong with you?" She pulled her tea to the side, crossed her arms, and leaned back in her chair. "Wolf, really?" Mary added. "He was confined to his bed for the past 8 months, he said, and then added loudly, he wore a diaper because he had no control over his bowels. And at that very moment, a young student, a girl, turned and crinkled her nose at him, causing Wolf to return the look right back to her, and said, "Oh, grow up, kid. We all have bowels, and every now and then they do whatever the hell they want to us." Returning his attention to them, he said, "He hallucinated. He cried." "That's enough," Susan said. "He howled. He demanded. He begged." "Wolf," Mary said, "enough." "He vomited. He was on constant painful withdrawal from something for the past 10 years, only to become addicted to something else. And you tell me you are depressed with all that? Well, I'm not." "Why are you so angry, Wolf?" Susan asked. "I'm not angry," he answered. "I'm simply saying that for once in its long, creepy career, Death, that goddamned thief, finally came at the right time." "I have always wondered if you were mentally ill," Ernest said. "Let him be," Mary added. "It's his way of healing." "And how are you healing?" Ernest asked her. "My usual way," she answered. "Guilt and trying to bargain with God to make it all not true." "Well, I'm not angry," Wolf said again. "It's all right if you're angry," Mary said. "Anger covers pain. There are other emotions under the anger, and you will get them in time." "Thank you, Dr. Mary," Wolf said. "Why don't we discuss something pleasant?" Mary said. "I know what we can do," Susan said happily. "We can all meet again, like we used to in the old days. Sundays. Remember how it was on Sundays? We can have that again. There's the 4 of us, and he'll be with us in spirit. What do you say? It'll be just like it was, just like it should be. One big, happy, maladjusted family." No one was interested. "What will you do with his things?" Wolf asked. "His things?" Susan asked indignantly. "His instrument, his things," Wolf said haltingly. He knew he was in trouble. Susan turned her slender body to face him. "What do you mean, what will I do with them?" "Well," he said slowly, "will you donate them to charity? Sell them, perhaps? There's a market, certainly. I could probably fetch well into the 6 figures or more for his instrument if you'll allow me to make inquiries." "I'll do no such thing," Susan snapped. "I'll keep them where they are, where they belong." "Why?" Wolf said equally loudly. "He left you nothing except debt. So why don't you let me sell them for whatever I can for you?" "Why?" Susan shouted emotionally. "Because they're his. They're his belongings. He's dead and gone, and you left you broke and here," Wolf said flatly. "You know he never liked you, and now I can see why," she whispered. "Oh, come on, this is uncalled for," Ernest said. "Heartless little schemer," she added, and then turned her back on him. No one spoke, but after several seconds, finally Ernest said softly, "However, the heartless little schemer, he is correct, Susan. He is dead, and you should start thinking about—" "That doesn't mean everything changes," she snapped. "That isn't what it means. Only people like you think like that." "Yes, I recognize that this is a somewhat inappropriate statement to make at this time," Wolf said. "When has an inappropriate ever stopped you?" Susan snarled. "All right," he said emphatically. "Okay, fine. Talk about not being liked." "I think we need to get off this," Ernest interjected, "before we say more things we don't mean." "I don't know why I'm here," Wolf said loudly. "I didn't like him very much, and then—" He corrected himself. "Not at the end." And turning to Susan, he said, "And I knew him for years before you arrived. There wasn't much about him to like at the end. I prefer to recall him as in his fantasy life," Ernest said. "The glamorous life. The ideal of him." When did you hear from him last, Ernest? Mary asked. Oh, 5 years, was it? 5 years, yes. But we were on again, off again constantly. He would stop the drugs, stop the boozing, and seemed genuinely interested in focusing on music again. But he had declined as a performer, although some of the old spark was there every now and then. He told me he was embarrassed by the bookings he was getting, retirement communities and that sort of thing. After he got ill last summer, he just decided to die, Susan said. He stopped playing entirely. It was all too painful for him. He felt like his career had been ripped from him, and he didn't have the great venues to play in any more. And that just crushed him. Ripped from him by who? Fate? Wolf asked. He screwed himself, plain and simple. They closed the doors to him, Susan said angrily. He was blacklisted. You know that. You know that more than anyone else. He was blacklisted because he lost control of himself, and as a result, everything around him disintegrated. His family and his career, everything, Wolf said. How can anyone with that much opportunity be called a victim? He had everything handed to him, and he messed it all up. When did you see him last? Ernest asked Wolf. Oh, well, he rolled his eyes and calculated. Last year? No, yeah, last year. Yes, when he had the liver failure issue. I phoned. I didn't actually see him. I didn't hear about it, Ernest said. We kept it under wraps, Susan added. He wanted it that way. He should have died then, Wolf said, twirling a plastic stick in his tea. Oh, ease up, will you? Ernest said. Why? I speak the truth. There have been other concert violinists with the same problems, and they did not just give up. Their careers did not suffer. Other concert artists have gone into decline, accepted it, and just moved on. But for some reason our boy could not bring himself to move along. The group of students slowly made their way into the cafe. Must they open the door every time they come in and leave? Wolf growled as he cast an evil eye on the departing students. Well, yes, that's the entire purpose of a door, Ernest said. Serves no other purpose. It lets in the cold air, he snapped. Well, have them exit through the back. How about that? Ernest said. Why don't we just meet in a bus station or something? He snarled. You have no idea what a bus station looks like. For all you know, this is a bus station. And what happened between you and him? Mary asked Wolf. He stopped talking to me about 10 years ago, he answered. I booked to play for a large condo in South Florida. The money was good. Glamorous, no, but a good paycheck, and I brought it to him in person. He was drunk, or maybe he was high, but he was in a foul mood. He was insulted, kept screaming, "A condominium!" and smashing things. He threw a lamp at me. Well, that was the last of us. Then he called earlier this year, and we spoke for a while. Never mentioned Florida. He stared out into the rain, and then turned to Susan and said, It is astounding how much of what he did to us we simply decided to forget. Although she was looking out the window, Susan reached across the table, and taking Wolf's mighty hand in her own, she kept it there. Mercurial. He was a mercurial performer, Ernest added. It was what I called him in my first column that I wrote about him. He didn't know what it meant. He assumed it meant mediocre. He was barely educated, Wolf added. So I look up from the desk, and the next morning there he is, red as a beet, my column in his clenched fist, demanding to know why I called him mercurial. I reached across the desk, opened up the dictionary, and read the definition. Wonderful word, mercurial. Related to the Roman god Mercury. unpredictable, lively, active, brilliant, impulsive, consistent. He said, "Oh, well, in that case, do you want to go have a few drinks?" I said yes. He needed an agent. I abhorred writing columns, so I told him I would be his agent. He agreed. We were both good and drunk by then, but I represented him for 7 years. Never had a written contract between us. I booked him in more than 100 concerts a year back then. He grossed almost $1 million a year from those shows. And then there were records. "And what happened between you?" Mary asked Ernest. "I was with him one afternoon," Ernest replied with a deep sigh. "We were both drinking, and this was in the beginning of the end, I guess, when he asked me, 'Why aren't I on television anymore?' And I lied and said I didn't know. Well, we argued, as drunkards do. Some in the spirit of complete meanness, I phoned, I have forgotten his name, the producer up in New York, he's dead now. I get the producer on the line, and I asked him, on the speaker phone no less, 'Why is our boy not on television anymore?' And the producer doesn't know, he doesn't miss a trick, of course, and he says, 'Because your boy's an unreliable drunk,' and he hung up. A few weeks later I got a letter from the questionably esteemed Mr. Wolfe, seated here, on my right, stating that he was now representing our boy. I thought it would be a good client," Wolfe said nervously, and turning to Ernest, added, "And I did not pursue him. He came to me." That was a lie. They all knew it, but the course of the conversation changed. "Where was the second wife? Why wasn't she here today?" I couldn't remember her name, but I could picture her beautiful face. "What is her name?" "The bitch from hell," Susan offered. "What was her name?" Ernest asked. "That was her name," Susan countered. "It was her title, actually," Wolfe offered. "Why did he marry her? She was so awful." "She thought he had the money, and he thought she had class," Susan said, recalling her face. "Jesus, he really was a hick back then, wasn't he?" "No," I said, "I think he was just young." "You could spot her a mile away," Wolfe said. "Well, now, we could, yes," Ernest replied. "She was the one who turned him onto drugs," Mary said. "He was an innocent drunk before her." "She didn't even have the class to show up to the man's funeral," Ernest said. "Well, thank God for that, because she's dead," Susan said happily. "Dead?" Ernest repeated. 7 or 8 years ago," Susan said. "Put a gun in that lovely mouth of hers and pulled the trigger." "I understand no one claimed the body," Mary added. "Jesus," Ernest whispered. "She was so beautiful." "What about the mother?" Wolfe asked. "You never hear much about his mother." "A drinker," Susan said, taking a sip from Wolfe's flask. "Very tragic. Dead, too." "I'd heard," Wolfe said. "His father pushed him mercilessly. Tried to pressure the kid for practice, hours and hours at a time." "Well, that's the oldest tune in the book, though, isn't it?" Ernest said. "He told me," Mary said, "that it was his old man that got him into Juilliard." "He got booted out, though," Wolfe said. "Why?" Mary asked. "Generic disciplinary reasons is what I've always read," Ernest said. "He seduced a teacher," Susan said flatly. "A man or a woman?" Wolfe asked. He was fishing for gossip. "You'd love it if it were a man, wouldn't you?" she answered. After a brief lull in the conversation, Susan said, "Well, his rise was fast and his descent was painfully slow." "I heard that when he returned home from international competitions, Moscow to Idaho—" "Colorado," Mary corrected. "All right, Colorado," Wolfe said. "I heard that when he returned home from Moscow to Colorado, that his father had choreographed a publicity stunt that included having the boy's horse meet him at the airport. That's a long drive for a horse, isn't it? Mary asked. And, Wolf said, tossing more gasoline on the fire, I just returned to the August Carnegie Hall. He sold the place out? Yes, we did, Ernest answered. But to that I say, so what? Putting asses in the seat doesn't quite equate to talent. We're not Hollywood, you know, Wolf said. The entire point of that concert, if you will remember, was to prove that he had the right stuff for a long-term career and that he wasn't just a pretty boy, flash in the pan. And all of you saw what happened. You were all there. All that he managed to do was to reinforce the image of a musician wonderfully adept at light repertory and at sea in Brahms. Show some goddamn tact, will you? Ernest begged. He succeeded for the wrong reasons, Wolf said firmly. It's the same with all of these competition winners. They never have a chance to recover. He is a cautionary tale of what can happen when a gifted young artist, still personally and musically immature, is turned into a global commodity for a spate of wrong reasons. His entire package was nothing more than mastery over a small body of 19th, 20th century showpieces that were intended to show off the violinist's art. That was all well and good in the beginning, but as the years went by, it grew old. He didn't mature, as Mary added, as a musician. And, Wolf continued, as expected, the critics took him to task increasingly for what they saw as correctly, I should add, of flash over substance. You used to be able to start an artist in Carnegie Hall Recital Hall and build them up over 7 years. Now you have a couple of competition winners who reign supreme over a limited ability until the next couple of winners comes along and pushes them out of the way. But, Ernest interjected, they always said that about him. From the very beginning, his repertoire relied too heavily on flash pieces that lacked depth. But it never bothered him, not in the beginning anyway. Nothing bad could touch him, and he knew it. He used to say to me, aside from technique of the highest caliber, you need the glitter, the conviction of your own style, the polish. He had no polish, Wolf said, looking directly at Ernest. Not the right kind. He had flash. There's a difference, you know. He was never an introspective artist. He said that once, Ernest said in his defense. He told me, Ernie, the problem with introspection is that it has no end. He failed completely in the heavier repertory, Beethoven and Brahms, Mary said. You know that. Because he was never given the opportunity early to develop and grow, Ernest said. That's not true, Wolf said. The opportunity was there for the taking. He chose not to take it, and he paid for it as a result. The Big Five orchestras barely acknowledged him. He played with Philadelphia and Cleveland, Ernest said. He played with them once, Wolf corrected him. Perhaps twice. Boston, Chicago, New York Philharmonics. Never. The music directors at those orchestras didn't want to spend their time conducting his repertory. And, had they asked for Beethoven or Brahms, he wasn't ready. You can't make a career just on bravura or repertory. But you can make a career out of being charming, Ernest said, and he was charming. And he was overbearing, Wolf added. And he could be tactless, Mary added. He told a conductor once, I've forgotten who it was, when he was told that he would have to perform a dual recital, I don't intend to share half the burden with the pianist. It's a violin recital, and I intend to play just that. My God, Wolf said as the memory came to him. He posed for After Dark. Do you remember that? What an uproar that caused. Do you recall that? How can I ever forget? Ernest answered mournfully. Wolf leaned into Ernest closely and whispered, Tell me truthfully, did you arrange that? You are really obnoxious, he answered. And no, I did not. He did it on his own. Ernest paused. and looked out into the rain and saw them, the two of them 20 years ago in Manhattan at the photo shoot. He's lying naked, belly down on a white carpet on the floor, the auburn red of the violin covering his torso, the bottom of Armand de Brignac in his hand. "Cheer up, Ernest. We're letting them see a new side of me." "Managing him could be a nightmare," Ernest said aloud, but barely above a whisper. "You're telling us," Wolf shouted. A group of students at the table turned to look at him. "You're being loud," Mary said, with an eye toward the kids. "Oh, fuck them," Wolf said, directly to the kids, and waving them off, he turned to Mary. "Our boy did a 3-page spread, shirtless and wearing cowboy gear." "Oh, I missed that one," Mary asked. "What's after dark?" "It was this gay rag," Wolf answered. "It was long before you were around." "Before I was around?" she asked. "Yes, you know, before you too were involved." "I think it was a legitimate weekly magazine filled with celebrities," Edward added. "Well, he was a cowboy, you know," Mary said. "Oh, please, not everyone from Colorado is a cowboy," Wolf said, waving her off. "Yes, true," Susan replied, "but everyone from Turkey Ridge, Colorado is a cowboy. I'm certain of that." "Cowboy, indeed," Wolf said dismissively. "He was trained at Juilliard." And then he turned Ernest and snickered. "You couched him onto wearing those damn boots." "I did not," Ernest said. "The man wore cowboy boots." "Snakeskin they were," Susan said. "Who, in the name of God, hunts down snakes for their skin? Where do they get people who do that sort of thing?" "He could stand on a horse, you know," Ernest said. "Only cowboys can do that." "Well, there's a talent every violinist needs," Wolf added, with majestic wave. "Did you advise him on that bit of trashy behavior as well?" "He could play violin on a horse," Mary said. "I saw him do it when we went to his father's ranch, or far, or whatever you call those horse places." "Oh, I'm so sorry I missed that," Wolf said, with a condescending air. "Well, anyway, it's difficult to do," Mary added. "How would you know?" Wolf cracked, and then added, "And once again I say unto ye, the triumph over flesh over substance. He could play violin on a horse, but he couldn't play Beethoven in New York or Chicago or anywhere else for that matter." Pensive for a moment, Ernest took a sugar packet, examined it, rolled it into a ball, and then snapped across the table with a flick of his fingers. Susan ran a manicured finger over the rim of her cup, squinted at Wolf, and asked, "What did you just say?" "That he wasn't a real cowboy," Wolf answered as he poured more whiskey into his coffee cup. "No," Susan said sharply, her lips closed tightly to her clear blue eyes, focused completely on Mary's face. "You said to her, before you two were involved." She leaned in and stared intently at Mary from across the small round table. "You were involved with my husband?" Wolf and Ernest looked across the table at Mary. There was no saving her for what was about to happen. Her mouth was open, her eyes were wide, her fingers dug into the sides of her cup. Then she took a deep breath. "That's not what I meant," Wolf lied. "I was for one summer," Mary said. "It's all ancient history," Ernest said, cutting her off before she dug the grave any deeper. The sentence was barely finished when Susan reached out and quickly slapped Mary across the face. Mary reached up, shock causing cup to tip and spill over the table. The shop fell silent as every eye watched this drama unfold. "You two-faced!" Susan searched for words, her face flushed. She raised her hand again, but Ernest took her by the wrist and lowered her arm to the table as Wolf sopped up the coffee from the table. "Everything all right over here?" the tall, thin young man from behind the counter asked in a way that was intending to be commanding. Does everything look fine? Wolf asked, and then waved his hand dismissively at the student, who stared across the shop as though they were frozen in place. Return to your commas. It happened quickly. It ended quickly, Mary said as she tilted her slender face up toward the white ceiling. I didn't know you then. Well, I didn't know you well. He told me that you two barely spoke. He lied. Of course, he lied about everything all the time. I learned that later. She looked directly across to Susan with her eyes filling quickly with tears. She shook her head and said, I was young, and he was beautiful, and I was stupid and dumb, and you were my best friend. And you are my only friend, Susan said, taking Mary's hand. And if a girl can't slap her only friend, who can she slap? And Mary laughed against her will and wiped away her tears, and Wolf rose a meaty hand in the air and shouted, Garçon, coffees! It's self-serve, Ernest told him. I don't know what that means, he replied. Well, it's much like your life's philosophy, Ernest said. He was flat broke, Susan said, and then taking Wolf's hands in hers again. Maybe you should look into selling his things, his instruments and all. They fell into a moment's silence. The public forgot him, Susan said. He became unfashionable. He should have known the public would tire of him, Wolf said. Celebrity in the mainstream is a fleeting thing, nothing more than a disposable commodity in the mainstream. It was about that time, Susan added, when he tried to come back by presenting himself in a more sober and serious light, but the classical world did not want him back. Well, no one took him seriously any more, Wolf said. Those people tend to mistrust sudden fame, you know. He once said to me, Wolf, my lad, fame will make me immortal. But actually fame killed him, and it killed him 100 times or more. He was so bewildered by it all, by the loss of his career, Susan said. He started losing weight, he drank more until he stopped playing the violin entirely. The young man from behind the counter arrived with a filthy white towel and sopped up the spilled coffee, and he walked back to his position to the counter, causing Wolf to point to a spot on the table and say, I think you failed to leave some germs here, on this spot. They were tired from the subject, and the gloom of the day darkened their moods. Are we okay? Wolf asked one and all. Is everything all right between us? No, Susan answered. But we will be. We just have to accept what happened to him was his own doing, really, and not ours. Well, what more can be said? Ernest asked. He seemed to be unable to thrive out of the limelight, so he withered and died, Wolf said. Even the brightest candles are not meant to burn too long. No one spoke for a moment until Wolf said, I should take a leak before we leave. And he did, and they waited for him, making small talk. And when he was finished, they gathered their coats and their hats. The rain had stopped, and the sun appeared cautiously from the clouds.